Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're looking at the final encounter in the Battle of Dazar'alor with the Jaina Proudmoore fight.
So this three-phase encounter is pretty epic, and it is certainly an awesome way to end the instance. The FATBOSS testing was working pretty well, but unfortunately we weren't able to see the entire thing. We do however have some pretty good ideas of how the entire fight works, so it should help you when you come to fight this boss in the next week or so. Anyway, let's jump straight in as always with Phase 1.
So the first part of the encounter takes place on a ship. Your goal is to get Jaina to 60% health to transition her into the second phase, whilst dealing with all of her mechanics, some adds, as well as some incoming ships. Now whilst it's not super important to keep an eye on during phase 1, it's good to know about it first. Throughout the fight, whenever you get hit by any frost damage, you'll gain stacks of chilling touch. This is a stacking dot debuff that reduces your movement speed. If you ever gain 20 stacks of the debuff and drop below 80% health, you'll be frozen in a block of ice. This deals ticking damage and you are out of line of sight of healers. The block despawns after about 30 seconds or so, or until it is killed by players. If the stack isn't refreshed on you throughout the fight, it will eventually drop, but you can also use heat sources to instantly remove it. Now for tanks in this phase, you need to keep control of Jaina's Ice Shard casts. This is a physical burst of damage that applies a debuff, increasing the damage you take from this spell by 10%, and this affects stacks. You just need a taunt to keep the stacks to a minimum. On a timer, Jaina will also cast Grasp of Frost. This is a Frost Nova typically targeted on melee players. This deals a burst of frost damage and roots players for 8 seconds. This effect can be dispelled. Also on a timer, the boss will cast Freezing Blast. This deals a burst of damage in a narrow cone directly in front of her after the cast is finished. If you're hit, you'll get knocked back, and potentially you can get knocked back off the ship, which will pretty much instantly kill you. So you've got to keep a close eye on her throughout this phase just to make sure that you're not knocked off. Now as the phase goes on, ships will actually come past and begin to bombard you, causing multiple targeting zones to form that will knock you back if you're hit. Afterwards, fire will remain on that location, dealing ticking damage, but you can also use these patches to remove your chilling stacks. This fire can quickly cover the entire ship, so eventually it does need to be cleared. Jaina actually helps you with this when she casts Avalanche. This is a debuff applied to the current tank and 2 other random players. Over the duration of this debuff, ice will fly down at your location, dealing massive damage to anyone still within the animation. The moment the debuff comes out, all afflicted players just need to go and run over the fire and try and clear as much of it as they possibly can, whilst they also avoid each other so they don't accidentally cross over and kill each other. The raid also needs to keep far away from these players just to make it as safe as possible. Now whilst testing, whenever a ship would arrive, you needed to fight them back by using the Dazar'alor ballistas by simply clicking on the ones that are directly opposite the attacking ship. This is not listed in the dungeon journal right now, so we're not quite sure if it will be on live. Now the ship will only leave once it's been hit by the Dazar'alor ballistas 6 times, but the problem is that there is only 3 on one side of the ship, and each time you use them, it has got a 10-second recharge, so it's going to take a minimum of 10 seconds before you can remove the ship. These ballista vehicles could however be set on fire, preventing you from using them for a while. The Avalanche debuff can however be used to clear the fire from them, allowing you to reuse them. You do not want to clear absolutely all the fire on the ship though. When the boss casts Ring of Ice, she'll create a massive zone around her. Any players caught in the zone at the end of the cast take a massive burst of damage and are instantly frozen. Players outside the circle take far less damage but are rooted instead for 8 seconds. If you however stood in the fire just before the cast finished, it would remove the root instantly. This is not listed in the dungeon journal, so we're not sure if it's intended. On top of all of this, you'll have cool tier and marines that will occasionally spawn in. These guys will drop in, placing barrels on the ground. If left alone, they'll explode after 15 seconds, dealing massive fire damage to all players on the ship. You can however interact with the barrels, take them to any side of the ship and throw them overboard. Aside that, the marines will fixate on a random player and hit them with moderate melee damage. You'll want to knock them back away from the fixated player while DPS just swaps to them and kills them off. The last thing to mention is that when Jaina hits 70% health, she'll cast Time Warp, increasing her haste by 30% for 40 seconds. This doesn't have any real effect on the fight, it just increases the rate in which her spells come out. And when she finally hits 60% health, she'll transition and you'll enter the first intermission.
Jaina teleports into the middle of the ocean and freezes the ship, knocking all players back. This knockback comes from whichever way you're facing, so you got to make sure that your back isn't faced directly off the ship as you will be knocked into the water and die. You then got to run and find Jaina through layers of fog and ice. Whilst running towards her, you've got to dodge glacial shards that are radiating away from her. Getting hit by one of these will instantly freeze you in ice, which is pretty bad at this point as you could potentially be locked out of the encounter space. You also have tornadoes to watch out for that deal a large amount of frost damage and knock you back if you're hit. One thing that we found particularly useful to do in this phase is actually just to send a rogue on ahead using Cloak of Shadows and Sprint, who can very quickly find Jaina. Once you get her, you just interrupt her cast and phase 2 will begin. Now whilst fighting her in this new area, you will be gaining chilling touch stacks periodically, regardless if you're hit by any frost damage spells. There is also far less heat sources to use, and this is where the difficulty lies through the phase. Now 3 barrels lay within the room. Each time a barrel is killed, it gives warmth to nearby players for a while, allowing you to completely drop your stacks. The barrel will also explode, so you do have to back away after you've received the warm debuff. Now the problem with the barrels is that they are buffed with refractive ice, flat out reducing the damage they take by 99%. The boss, however, debuffs players with broadside. This debuff deals a small amount of ticking damage until it expires, where a large targeting circle appears underneath you. Shortly afterwards, these locations will explode, dealing massive damage to anyone hit, but more importantly, it will remove the refractive ice from the barrels if they are hit by the circle. So each time you need to use a barrel, one of the players of the broadside debuff needs to stand on top of it, then move away the moment the debuff drops, wait for the hit to land, and then the raid can swap to the barrel and then stand close to it to remove their stacks. But of course this phase isn't just as simple as standing near some barrels that are on fire, you do have Jaina to deal with. She will still cast Ice Shard on the tank, and she still has access to her Avalanche ability, although it is slightly different. This is now only cast on the tank, and it still works the same way. Loads of little zones will be marked, and then they'll explode, dealing a huge amount of damage to anyone within them. However, each time they do hit the ground, a few projectiles will come out of them. These Hands of Frost projectiles will deal damage and root any player who is hit by them for 8 seconds, so you really got to do your best to dodge them. This is made easier by having the tank run directly away from wherever the raid is, as that will give more distance between the raid and the incoming projectiles. Also, what's new to look out for is the Glacial Ray. Jaina will face the direction of a random player and begin to send a beam towards them, filling that area with frost. This will deal high ticking damage to anyone hit. You've got to keep an eye on which way she's facing and just be ready to dodge the cast. Also to keep an eye out for is the Icefall. The boss will mark one area of the frozen wall, and moments later, comets will fall in a line from the direction the mark is pointing. Getting hit deals a large amount of frost damage, and the patch left behind will slow you and increases the rate in which you gain chilling touch stacks. Last to mention is the Siegebreaker Blast. This debuff is applied to a random player, and when it expires it deals massive drop-off damage to the entire raid, and also knocks players back if they're too close. The debuff player just needs to make as much space between themselves and the raid before it expires to help reduce incoming damage. But that's everything you got to deal with in this phase. So just to summarise, you just got to do your best to deal with all of the mechanics whilst keeping the stacks you gain to a minimum. You've got to use these barrels as late as possible while still keeping it safe, just to prevent people from being frozen, and hope that you can get her into the next intermission before you run out of barrels. Because there are only 3 of them, they never respawn, and if you start wasting them, you're not going to leave this phase. And unfortunately, we didn't leave this phase, so we can't show you exactly what happens next, sadly. We do, however, have a good idea of what you need to do.
So once Jaina hits 40% health, she'll teleport into the middle of the room and cast Flash Freeze. This places a stack of Chilling Touch every 15 seconds to the raid, whilst an ever-increasing zone of frost expands out from her. If any player is hit, they're immediately frozen by it. And at the end of the cast, Jaina will shatter all frozen players, instantly killing them. This expanding zone will eventually cover the entire room, so you need to fight your way out of the room by destroying one of the ice walls. You need to save all cooldowns, likely including Bloodlust, just so you can burst down the wall and get behind it, safely away from the Flash Freeze circle. Behind the wall is a Tide Elemental. The Elemental needs to be nuked down whilst you dodge the incoming Arcane Barrage zones from Jaina. Getting hit by these deals a little bit of damage and knocks you back. Now the Elemental will cast Heart of Frost. This causes a random player to burst frost damage to all nearby players, so you've got to make sure you quickly move away from others if you ever get this debuff. Also to watch out for is the Water Bolt Volley. This deals frost damage to absolutely all players in the raid if it isn't interrupted, so you're going to need to make sure that you have some form of interrupt rotation. And finally, if the ad ever reaches 100% energy, he'll cast Frost Nova, which roots all players within 12 yards of him. Ideally, you'll want to kill this elemental before this is even cast. Once the elemental is defeated, you can move back to Jaina and phase 3 begins. Now this last phase is kind of similar to the second, except you have absolutely no way of clearing your Chilling Touch stacks, apart from becoming frozen. The boss will still cast Ice Shard on the tank, and to add, she'll also do a Frontal Cone towards them. Players will still be debuffed for Broadside and Siegebreaker Blast, and you have to deal with them pretty much in the exact same way, except you no longer need the Broadside to of course land on a barrel, because you don't have them anymore. You'll also need to make sure you keep dodging the Glacial Ray and the Icefall. What is new, however, is the Orb of Frost. This Frost Orb is fired out towards a random range player. Once the orb reaches the player, it will explode, applying a large amount of chilled stacks to the entire raid. You can, however, intercept the orb before it reaches the final player by moving into it, which deals light ticking frost damage to those players, but it reduces the overall power of the orb. Once the power of the orb is completely removed, the amount of stacks that the raid gains once it hits the player is significantly reduced. Now, as it is likely impossible to kill the boss without everyone gaining 20 stacks at least once throughout this last phase and becoming frozen, you want to use this orb to offset which players become frozen at which point, as of course you don't want the entire raid to become frozen at the exact same time. Just before the players that you've just decided to go and soak the orb with are about to hit 20 stacks, you'll want them to move towards melee and stand slightly spread apart, making sure no one is stood on top of them, nor no one is in front or behind them. This is because any frozen player in the last phase is almost immediately targeted by Shattering Lance. A single lance will spawn per frozen player, and shortly after spawning near Jaina will fire directly towards that player, dealing a small amount of damage to all players hit, but triple damage to any players that are frozen. Once they've been hit, you then just have to free the player before they slowly tick down and die, or just die to other sources of damage. Once they're free, their stacks are completely reset and they can continue on with the rest of the fight. How many people you're going to need to stagger and freeze each time we don't exactly know yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if you need to use roughly a third or perhaps even half your raid each time you do it. But again, you should only have to do it once in this last phase. The only issue really with this is that there are so many other abilities going on, it's going to become incredibly hectic. And also to add, there is one final ability which we haven't mentioned yet, which is the Prismatic Image. This is noted in the Dungeon Journal as a fragment that appears and just duplicates Jaina's spells while it's alive, so we're guessing that you're just going to need to swap and kill it off really fast before it becomes too overwhelming. But that's the fight.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mammoth encounter and it is an awesome fight. It's just a real big shame that we didn't get to see the end of it since it sounds so crazy, and it would have been nice to experiment with the number of people needed to be frozen, because as you've said, it definitely feels like it's just going to be a cycle in that last phase where half of the raid or 1/3 of the raid gets frozen, then the other third gets frozen, and then the other third, and you just keep circling around that until your healers just don't heal anymore because they've run out of mana. Well, the thing is, while you're frozen, you're so vulnerable because the boss's abilities, so many of them are targeted. Broadside, you need to move from Icefall, you need to move from a Glacial Ray, you need to move from the frontal cone at the tank. All of this is movement-based abilities, and you ain't going to be moving much when you're inside one of those little ice blocks. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it's even done, because, yeah, not many people did manage to get to see this phase at all, and there's certainly no public footage of it, so it's very hard to find out what really goes on here. But it definitely feels like this is the first boss, this expansion, that is going to be pretty fucking difficult. We've taken some time to read the dungeon journal and it looks absolutely terrifying. There's like a gathering storm, like the whole vision mechanic from the intermission seems to be in all phases periodically, and to add, players need to be stood near each other at all times, otherwise they'll be frozen after 6 seconds. And you know what I was just saying about, everyone needs to move all the time? Well, now you've got to move with a partner all the time. And at the beginning you only need to move with 1 other person, then it goes up to 3 other people, and then eventually 5 other people, and then eventually you can't see anything, so you don't even know where the Icefall marker is, so you don't know how to dodge it, and oh my god, it sounds hellish.
It sounds horrific, yeah. But even the heroic version of the encounter is going to be pretty damn hard, I think.
Yeah,
the amount of organization and just communication that you need in that last phase is pretty remarkable, and it really wouldn't surprise me if some of the heroic-only guilds actually struggle on this one in the first week or even 2 weeks. But difficulty aside, the pacing is perfect. There's not really a dull moment in the entire fight, at least from what we tested. You could argue maybe there were certain sections of Phase 1 where there wasn't too much going on, but at the same time that kind of gave you time to mentally prepare and get ready for other mechanics that are coming in.
And talking about pacing, Phase 2 is terrifying, like the entire time, because there's so many mechanics that are forcing you to move, but you want to stick close together and get ready with barrels, so you want to do barrel 1, barrel 2, and barrel 3 in really precise timings, but then an ice falls on top of the barrel, you're like, well, that's just fucked our plans. So you've got to be really flexible the entire time, constantly keeping an eye on, oh shit, I'm going to freeze to death really, really soon. We've got to hurry this up. So it keeps you really tense. You never feel comfortable in Phase 2, which is a really, really nice thing to see. And in Phase 3, it's going to be even worse.
Yeah, it's going to be horrific. And also the spectacle of the fight is fantastic.
Oh yeah, being on a ship and you fall off the ship and you realize that they're all stood still, that kind of ruins it. But the rest of it, when you're actually, doing the fight properly, you do feel awesome. Everything's flying past, and then you're in a giant ice arena. Oh, Yeah, it's great. It's really nice because considering so much of the instance is in places that we've already seen before, you know, because it's just the Horde main city. I guess you get to go inside the temple, which is nice. But yeah, it's nice having a last boss that's in an entirely new area with this whole ice arena. It's super cool.
But that's all we got time for, guys. Hope you enjoyed this little preview. If you did, then do show us some love. Give us a like. We appreciate it. And we will catch you all next week with updated guides. So keep an eye on the channel, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.